There's a specific kind of silence you only get by a lake at 5 in the morning, a sort of heavy, mist-covered quiet that makes you feel like the only person left on Earth. And for 2 years, that silence was the reason I woke up smiling every single day. My name is Miller Vance, and after 30 years of inspecting bridges and calculating load bearings for the state, I'd earned every square inch of my cedar-sided sanctuary on Blackwood Lake, but apparently, the local homeowners association felt that my retirement was a little too peaceful. I'd just gotten back from a 20-day trip visiting my sister out west, dragging my suitcase through the front door and looking forward to nothing but a cold beer and the view of the water. But when I stepped on my back deck, the view had changed significantly. There was a dock, a massive, pressure-treated lumber monstrosity, bolted directly into the shoreline of my property, stretching 30 feet out into the glass-like water where my private view used to be. I stood there for a long minute, just blinking, wondering if I'd walked into the wrong house. But no, there was my dog, Buster, sniffing at a pile of sawdust the construction crew had left behind on my lawn, and that's when the exhaustion of travel flipped into a slow, localized heat in my chest. I didn't even unpack. I just marched straight over to the house of the one person I knew had to be behind this, a woman named Sheila Vance, no relation, thank God, who had recently clawed her way into the HOA presidency. Sheila is the kind of person who wears a visor indoors and treats the neighborhood bylaws like the 10 Commandments. If the 10 Commandments were mostly about mailbox font sizes and the exact shade of beige allowed for window trim. I found her in her driveway, rearranging her recycling bins with a level of intensity that suggested she was preparing for a military inspection, and I didn't even give her a chance to look up before I asked her what the hell was sitting in my backyard. She didn't flinch, she just adjusted her sunglasses, looked me up and down like I was a leaf she'd found on her shoe, and told me in that high-pitched, sing-song voice of hers that the board had decided the community needed more water access, and since my lot had the, in quote, most favorable grade A slope, end quote, they'd voted to install the new guest dock there. I felt my jaw tighten, that old engineer brain of mine starting to run through the legalities, and I told her as calmly as I could that the board doesn't have the authority to vote on what happens to private land they don't own. She actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that reminded me of a car alarm, and told me that according to a, end quote, recent amendment, end quote, in the neighborhood charter, the first 15 feet of any shoreline were considered a communal easement for, end quote, recreational enhancement, end quote. I knew right, then she was lying through her teeth because I'd memorized my deed before I'd even signed the closing papers. And there wasn't a single word about communal easements on my shoreline. I told her she had 48 hours to get a crew out there to dismantle it, or I'd do it myself. And she just crossed her arms, telling me that if I touched a single bolt of that, end quote, association-funded asset, end quote, she'd have the police at my door for destruction of property and grand larceny, considering the lumber alone cost the neighborhood 5 figures. I walked back home, my heart hammering against my ribs, and instead of going to bed, I went into my home office and pulled out the massive, leather-bound folder containing the original survey of Blackwood Estates from 1988. I spent the next 4 hours under a desk lamp, tracing the lines, and sure enough, my property line didn't end oppose. T-stop at the grass. It extended 12 feet into the lake bed, a rare, end quote, wet deed, end quote, that I'd paid a massive premium for specifically to keep people from doing exactly what Sheila had just done. Not only was there no easement, but the HOA had literally trespassed with a capital T, and they'd done it while I was 2,000 miles away, thinking they could just present it as a finished deal when I got back. The next morning, I did my due diligence, calling the county building department and the Department of Natural Resources, and the news was even better than I'd hoped. Not only had no one filed for a permit to build a dock on my lot, but the DNR officer nearly choked on his coffee when I described the size of it, because Blackwood Lake is a protected habitat for the blue-spotted salamander. And driving pilings into the silt without an environmental impact study is a massive state-level no-no. I waited exactly 48 hours, and when the sun went down on the second night without a word from Sheila, I didn't end oppose. To get angry, I got my toolkit. I spent the next 6 hours under the moonlight with a high-torque impact driver and a heavy-duty crowbar, systematically unbolting the entire structure. And because I'm a structural engineer, I knew exactly which points to hit to make the whole thing come apart like a Lego set without damaging the wood. By 3 in the morning, The dock was gone, and in its place was a neat, professional-grade stack of premium cedar and pressure-treated 4x4s sitting on my driveway, covered with a heavy tarp. I felt a strange sense of peace as I sat on my porch, watching the moon reflect off the now unbroken water, knowing that the community asset was now just a very expensive pile of lumber sitting behind my truck. The explosion happened at 7 a.m. sharp, and I didn't end oppose to even have to look out the window to know Sheila had arrived. She was screaming so loud that Buster started howling in the kitchen, and when I stepped out onto the porch, she was standing by my driveway, her face a shade of purple I didn't know the human body could produce. She was pointing at the empty shoreline and then at my tarp-covered pile, screeching about how she was calling the sheriff and that I was going to rot in a cell for stealing from my neighbors. I just leaned against the railing, took a slow sip of my coffee, and told her that I hadn't stolen anything. I'd simply performed an emergency cleanup of illegal debris that had been dumped on my private property. I told her that if she wanted the wood back, she could sue me for it, but she'd have to explain to a judge why the HOA had built a permanent structure on a wet deed lot without a single permit or signature from the owner. She didn't oppose to say another word. She just hissed something about, ruining me, and peeled out of my driveway, leaving a patch of rubber on the asphalt. But here's where the story takes a turn from a neighborhood squabble into something much darker, because about 2 days later, I got a visit from a guy named Arthur Penhaligon, a quiet, retired accountant who lived 2 doors down and had been the HOA treasurer for about a decade before Sheila forced him out. He came over with a box of donuts and a look of genuine concern, and once we were sitting on my back deck, he told me that something didn't add up about that dock. He'd seen the internal invoice Sheila had posted in the board and oppos as private portal before he lost his access, and the association had supposedly paid $28,000 for that construction. I looked at the pile of wood in my driveway. It was nice wood, sure, but even with labor, there was an oppos more than $8,000 or $9,000 sitting there. Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper, and told me that the contractor listed on the invoice was a company called Blue Water Renovations, which he'd looked up and discovered was registered to a P.O. box in the next county, and the registered agent for that P.O. box was Sheila's brother-in-law. That was the moment the game changed, because suddenly, this wasn't an oppos just about a dock. It was about a woman using my backyard as a front for a kickback scheme to drain the association's reserve funds. I spent the next week playing detective, working with Arthur and a few other neighbors who were tired of Sheila's iron fist, and we started digging into every improvement project the HOA had done in the last 2 years. We found a walking trail that cost $15,000 but was really just a bag of wood chips spread over a pre-existing path, and a security system for the front gate that cost $10,000 but was actually just 2 off-the-shelf Ring cameras. It was a systematic, slow-motion robbery of our community, and the dock in my backyard had been the biggest payout yet. I decided to go for the throat, and instead of calling a lawyer, I called the state auditor's office and the DNR again, but this time I gave them the names of the board members and the invoices Arthur had managed to screenshot. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Sheila was hosting a beautification committee meeting at her house, 3 white SUVs from the county sheriff's white-collar crime unit and a van from the state environment protection agency pulled into the neighborhood. They didn't oppose to go to my house. They went to hers. I watched from my lawn as they spent hours carrying boxes of files out of her garage, and the look on her face when they let her out in handcuffs for misappropriation of funds and felony fraud was better than any sunset I'd ever seen. It turned out she'd been cooking the books for years, and my theft of the dock materials had been the one thing she couldn't oppose to explain away, because she couldn't oppose to file a police report against me for stealing the lumber without admitting that the lumber was part of an illegal, unpermitted project funded by a fraudulent invoice. The fallout was massive, and the HOA board was dissolved by a court-appointed receiver within the month. But the best part was the restitution phase. Because the dock had been built with stolen funds on my private land, the court eventually ruled that the materials were, in fact, abandoned property, and I was given full legal ownership of the wood. I didn't in oppos. To keep it, though, I'm not that kind of guy. I ended up donating the entire stack to a local nonprofit that builds wheelchair-accessible fishing piers for disabled kids at the public park down the road. I even helped them with the engineering specs to make sure it was built to code. Now, when I sit out on my deck, the silence is back, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's the quiet of a neighborhood that's finally breathing again. The new board is made up of people like Arthur, people who actually care about the lake and the people who live here, and I haven't in oppos. Seen a visor or a beige paint sample book in months. But I still think about that morning I came home and saw that eyesore in my yard. And I realized that sometimes you have to let someone build a bridge or a dock right into their own trap. It makes me wonder, though, how many other, in quote, Sheila and oppos, in quote, are out there right now, measuring people in oppos, grass while they in oppos, quietly emptying the community into oppos, as pockets. Have any of you ever had to deal with an HOA that thought they owned the ground you walked on, or found out that the person, in quote, enforcing, in quote, the rules was the one breaking all of them? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, because if they're in oppos, one thing I in oppos, learned, it's that in quote, wet deed, in quote, is a powerful thing, but a neighbor with a spreadsheet is even more dangerous. Like, subscribe, and let me know, did I go too far by taking apart myself? Or was that the only way to get the truth to float to the surface?